This whole video could be pointless in a week or two with the upcoming release of Mayhem 2.0. Nonetheless, I feel the urge to share another build. I believe I've finally achieved a long-standing goal of mine, making a melee build, actual melee where you press the melee button, viable in Mayhem 4. This build pulls out all the stops. We use everything we know, and some things we don't, to make melee powerful. This build features some gear that everyone uses in their melee Amara build, and some gear that no one uses. It functions and it's built entirely differently than any melee build I've ever seen. It's a build that actually makes good use of grenades, and the best grenade for it is the most widely disappointing legendary grenade in the game. Normally I like to introduce and explain things before showing them in action, but I've been monologuing long enough. This is Black Swan. I see an Amara build touted as melee only to find out it relies entirely on the Facepuncher, I feel kind of cheated. Don't get me wrong, Facepuncher builds are powerful and interesting. The Facepuncher is quite a unique gun with many different possible variables contributing to its damage output, and we use the Facepuncher in this build to take care of bosses and flying enemies and to get up from fight for your life. But it's not melee. When I refer to melee in this video, I'm referring to actually pressing the melee button, not pressing the trigger button and firing a gun. As you can see, this build uses Ties That Bind for its action skill, not Phase Slam, the more common action skill used for melee or Facepuncher builds. Most people use Phase Slam for the extra damage anointments, namely plus 300% damage after Phase Slam for the Facepuncher, and plus 200% melee damage after Phase Slam on a shield. We are not focused on the Facepuncher though, and that extra melee damage isn't crucial. Also, Phase Slam has a very long cooldown, and those anointments wear off well before it's available again. Ties That Bind has a cooldown half as long, and we'll be making it even shorter. Not to mention, Ties That Bind is an extremely powerful skill all on its own. We'll be taking advantage of that. Part of the theory of this build comes from the formula for melee damage, or just damage formulas in general. Here's the formula for melee damage in Borderlands 3. Don't freak out, it's actually quite simple. The different colored blocks each have their own set of things put into them, and then each block is multiplied by the others. Often, melee builds focus merely on adding things mostly to one block, the green one. As you can see, the green block consists of just about everything that adds melee damage. Our goal is to have plenty to put in the green block, but also give some attention to another block, the magenta one. Let's simplify this a bit. If we put all of our eggs into one basket, we might get a large number in that basket, but it's still being multiplied by a small number, the base melee damage. If we can get lots of items in the green block, but also get a few items in the magenta block, then all three get to be multiplied together, and we end up with a larger result. This formula, by the way, isn't quite complete. There's another factor which we will be exploiting to the best of our ability, and that is that our total melee damage is multiplied by 3 if an enemy is frozen. Being able to freeze enemies fairly reliably upgrades this build from acceptable to kinda incredible. So yes, we employ both melee damage and elemental damage, the strengths of green and red skill trees respectively, to increase the damage of our punches. We utilize the core of the blue tree as well, which is rush stacks, in order to maximize our chances of freezing enemies. Philosophically, this build appeals to me greatly. We stand on the entire foundation of Amara's skills with all 3 trees. We use true melee, but also use a gun where melee can't reach, that is, flying enemies, bosses, and fight for your life. This is a gun game after all. It's nice to fire a gun once in a while, my slam build notwithstanding. So let's fill out these trees. 3 points to do harm, to increase the damage that Ties That Bind shares between enemies. This will help our mobbing capability. 5 points into Violent Tapestry because we want to be proccing status effects and this is key, increasing our cryo efficiency. Outside of freezing things in cryo efficiency, we can get some big status effect damage, as you'll see. 5 points into Restless, which, if you've watched my other videos, is one of my favorite skills. I'm all about action skill cooldown rate. 1 point into Ascendant to increase the radius of Allure. Allure will stagger enemies for a short time, keeping them from damaging us and allowing us to close the distance. Onto the green tree. We need to become more tanky. 5 points to Root to Rise for greater max health. 5 points into Clarity for backup healing. Clarity does a lot of work, especially if you're nimble enough. In the midst of several strong enemies, your health will go down, and jumping away to phase grasp an enemy will let Clarity put you above health cape. 4 points into Helping Hands for essential damage reduction. It's kind of a toss-up between 5 points here and 5 points in Root to Rise, or 4 in this one and 4 in Root to Rise. Our last point for the green tree goes to Find Your Center for 100% melee damage and, more importantly, increased melee range. With this skill you can close short distances in an instant, as well as easily melee grasped enemies floating in the air. In the red tree we have 5 points to Anima and Tempest. Remember that magenta part of the formula? These are a no-brainer. We grab Illuminated Fist as it's an easy 75% additional melee damage, and it makes our melee damage elemental. 2 for 1. Now we need to get down to Sustainment, so these next points are only for minor benefit. 3 points into Steady Hands to reduce the spread of our Facepuncher shots. 5 points into Wildfire to spread status effects around. As you may know, irradiated enemies can give other enemies their status effect if they are close enough. Cryoed enemies do the same. When that status effect gets passed, it can actually proc Wildfire without us doing anything, and even further spread the status effects. Status effects will be spreading like there's a pandemic going on. Ultimately, the real benefit we get out of this is more enemies are slower. This effect isn't very pronounced, but it helps. 1 point to Dread in the off chance you kill, say, a flying enemy that you've grasped with your Facepuncher. Now we're at Sustainment. This is our main source of healing. We end up doing enough elemental damage with our melee attacks that it can keep us alive. 1 point to Forceful Expression for even more elemental damage, for even more eggs to put in our magenta basket. Ties That Bind is essential. It will send our melee damage to every enemy in the vicinity. So many times I've jumped into a group of enemies, grasped one, meleeed it to death, and afterward found none of the group alive. I usually grasp and attack the strongest mob in a group unless they're an anointed enemy. Not to mention, grasping a strong enemy is so important for keeping them and enemies near them from damaging you for a brief period of time. It is the skill for melee, in my opinion. Alright, so where's our elemental damage coming from? It's not just Illuminated Fist, is it? No, we'll be using this artifact, Cryostone Static Charge. The first part is pretty self-explanatory. It adds 80% bonus melee damage as cryo damage to all of our melee attacks, and is a big part in how we get enemies to freeze. The second part though, what, is sliding part of this build? No, you actually don't need to slide at all. This artifact adds shock damage to melee attacks all the time, and it's actually 100%, not 50% as listed on the card. It also chains the damage to nearby enemies. What gets chained is a portion of the shock damage, your action skill and bonus elemental damage on your grenade, and a small amount from Forceful Expression. It's great for chewing through shields and healing us through Sustainment. So each melee gets plus 180% bonus elemental damage from this artifact. And remember, that's in our magenta basket. Let's add more to the green basket and take a look at our shield. Ah yes, the Brawler's Ward. Classic standby of melee and Facepuncher builds everywhere. Plus 300% melee damage when depleted. And there's our melee damage anointment, plus 100% on action skill end. This anointment, unlike the Phase Slam anointments mentioned earlier, works with Ties That Bind. My shield is level 1, but that's really only a time saver so it will deplete faster. And on level 1 would do just fine. Your shield would get depleted no matter what, since we are always in the middle of the fight. Also, while it's depleted, we get some fairly good health regeneration to complement our regen from Clarity. Of course, this really only works if we disable Guardian rank perks Shield Reboot and Emergency Response. We simply cannot have those perks enabled with this build. To further increase melee damage, you're going to be holding this gun while punching, the butt plug. Man, why Gearbox gotta make it awkward? The butt plug is easily the strongest melee weapon in the game. The card says plus 110% melee damage, but it vastly outperforms a bladed COV pistol with plus 120% melee damage from the attachment and a plus 100% melee anointment. The butt plug must have some sort of hidden bonus of probably over 300% in addition to what's shown on the card, and it hits even harder from behind, something that's easy to do to grasped or frozen enemies. What's aesthetically pleasing to me is that Amara won't be swinging the gun. With Find Your Center proc, which we will always have, Amara uses her bare hand to deliver blows. An essential aspect of freezing enemies, and therefore greatly increasing our damage, is rush stacking with the Facepuncher class mod and fake grasping. With this build, you need to get into the habit of grasping the air a few times whenever you get a free moment, as it will build up stacks of violent tapestry. Without this, freezing enemies goes from a regular occurrence to a rarity. The Facepuncher also helps in two other ways. One, with points into Clarity, it helps our passive healing. Anima is helpful as well. 2, it increases our action skill cooldown rate. We want our Ties That Bind back as fast as possible for keeping up our anointments and for, well, killing lots of enemies. Action skill cooldown rate as a passive on the Facepuncher is required, and it is also required on our Cryostone static charge. With both of those, plus our 5 points in Restless, plus say 10% cooldown from Guardian rank, we will have our action skill back in about 8 seconds. Now, earlier I mentioned that we use a disappointing grenade. Indeed, it's widely said that it needs a buff. I'm here to show it some love. We use the Fastball, specifically a cryo one. Even more specifically, one anointed with bonus cryo damage. The anointment is actually more important to our build. That bonus cryo damage and action skill end, plus our Cryostone, plus our stacks of violent tapestry, all are a recipe for freezing enemies. If you were to have some other elemental anointment, enemies freezing would be uncommon and inconsistent. So wait, if the anointment is what matters, why am I using a Fastball? Let me show you something. Yep, that's a 23k damage tick, aka 69k damage per second. Nice. But no, really, nice. With my 7 out of 5 into Anima, that's over 800k damage to flesh. With one grenade. The Fastball needs to be buffed? That would be nice, but hell no, it doesn't need it. It's one of the best grenades in the game. At least, on Amara. That fire damage tick is from Forceful Expression, and the chance of a dot proccing is increased by Violent Tapestry. A dot doesn't proc every time, but since we're stacking Violent Tapestry with this build, the chance of getting this extra damage from our grenade is pretty high. What's weird is, the damage over time is the highest with the cryo version of the Fastball. Even a non-elemental version with a much higher card damage gives a lower dot damage. I have no idea why. The dot damage from the Fastball has another use. From all my research and testing regarding what it takes to make an enemy freeze, I have come to the conclusion that if you increase any of the following 3 things, an enemy is more likely to freeze. 1. The amount of damage you deal. 2. The instances of damage you do within a given time. And 3. The percentage of that damage you deal as cryo damage. A Fastball dot increases the first 2 things, dealing a lot of instances of damage and having that damage hit hard. Now, as long as I'm also meleeing whatever enemy is affected by the dot, the chances of that enemy freezing should increase, given that I'm doing cryo damage with my melee. This has been my experience at least. And our cryo anointment, as opposed to any other element, increases number 3, the percentage of damage that we're dealing as cryo damage. Further, the Fastball is great defensively. If you are at low health and you grasp and link some enemies, then throw a Fastball at them, your health will instantly shoot back up. This is because the elemental damage from the impact heals us through sustainment. And if you have, say, an enemy shooting rockets at you that you just can't get to, throwing a Fastball at them will almost always cause them to pointlessly dive at the floor, allowing you to approach and give them the business. Ultimately, yes, the 50% bonus cryo damage on the grenade is more important than the Fastball itself. So if you don't have one of these or don't feel like farming it, choose a grenade with a cryo anointment and some mobbing utility, such as the Hyperion Quasar. So the general game plan is to grasp the air a couple times, grasp the strongest enemy in a group, chuck a Fastball at them, and then just go to town. If you go down, switch to the Facepuncher and you'll usually end up freezing whatever enemy you shoot on your way back up, which allows you to get a second wind from even the tankiest of enemies. Yes, you will go down with this build. Endgame Mayhem 4 content is not kind to melee builds, but you will almost always get back up. And as you learn the playstyle of this character, you will go down less often. This is the toolset for mobbing. We need one extra item for killing bosses, the Shooting Star Shield. This shield is buggy as all hell and creates some spectacular screen clutter, but oh, it's so much fun to use. Its special effect is that when it's depleted, melee attacks spawn a projectile that rains down and impacts the enemy you hit. So if you use this shield with the Facepuncher, each pellet from each shot will proc a shooting star, and these stars are powerful. On most maps, the spawn point of the melee projectile makes it so it never impacts the enemy you damaged. But in boss arenas, the projectiles usually work, one way or another. You may have to shoot the boss in a weird spot for the shooting stars to hit. For Gravehorde, I found the best option is to shoot his chin or beard. For Tyrene, you want to shoot to the left of her head. For Wotan, the stars work perfectly, coming from straight above. Way high above. If your shooting star shield is elemental, that is, if it has an elemental resistance, then the projectiles will be that same element and allow for healing through sustainment. And if it has an elemental damage anointment, that damage will get added to the shooting stars. So if you need to farm one of these for taking out bosses, all you need is an elemental one with an elemental damage anointment. The elements really don't matter as long as the anointment isn't cryo, because we already have that anointment on our grenade. I've been using a shock one, and have no problems with that against flesh or armor bosses. I don't have a cryo shooting star, but I can only imagine how amazing that would be for mobbing. Some maps do allow you to use the shooting star for mobbing. Slaughter allows this, except for the raised area in the back corner. The shooting stars are powerful and make for strong healing, but you have to fight through screen clutter and sometimes you have to rotate around enemies to get the stars to hit. But I like to give it a try whenever I can, simply because it's so fun. As you can probably tell, this is not a lazy build. Its gameplay requires thinking and situational awareness, and deft movement, and sometimes a little patience. It has a lot of factors going into its success. A lot of tools are needed to operate it, and it is unfortunately pretty gear specific, but I think these are all reasonable criteria for using a strong Mayhem 4 true melee build, and it sure is super rewarding to punch enemies into ice chunks. That's mostly it for this build. I have a few extra notes though. Here I am running through the Pyre of Stars. I find this area really good for general mobbing. A lot of people like to run Athenas, and I do too, but the Pyre of Stars offers a little more variety with COV and Guardian enemies. Plus, it's a beautiful map. Also, Maliwan heavies, especially the badass ones, can be extra tanky toward our build. Usually it's a case of them being the same element as our action skill element, that is, the element that Illuminated Fist is converting our melee damage to. Also, the dot from our Fastball won't do any damage to them since that comes from our Forceful Expression. If you find yourself up against these enemies, either switch elements or link them to a grasped enemy and hope that Ties That Bind takes care of the problem. Maliwan enemies in general seem to be harder to freeze than COV, except for the Nogs, they're really easy for some reason. Lastly, this is a build where the passive bonus to max grenade capacity is actually very helpful. Fastballs are very strong with this build, and being able to throw more of them will make mobbing quite a bit easier. I really think the Fastball should be considered top tier for Amara. As long as you're spec'd into Violent Tapestry, Anima, and Tempest, the Fastball could do some work. You can kill weak enemies pretty easily. And oh yeah, the save file for this build is in the description. So that's Black Swan. So named because it's the only of its kind as far as I can tell. It's an actual Mayhem 4 melee build, something that many think is not possible. It's also named after myself, of course, and probably because this is my swan song, so to speak. These videos take up way too much of my time, and I'm quite satisfied with the 3 builds that I've shared. So, don't expect anything more out of me. Just enjoy the game. Thanks for watching.